At the end of the Cold War, Americans were feeling pretty full of themselves, and understandably so. The United States had faced off against the Soviet Union for 45 years or so in this world struggle, and the American side had come out on top. The end of the Cold War coincided pretty much with the American victory, or the American-led victory, in the Gulf War of 1991 against Iraq, which gave Americans additional reason for thinking that the American system must have a lot going for it. So Americans entered this post-Cold War period thinking, all right, we are going to tell the world the way the world ought to act. At least this was the thinking of those who spoke very confidently and proudly of the United States as the world's sole superpower. Some went so far as to call the United States not just a superpower, but a hyperpower, something beyond which the world had never seen, something the world had never seen before. There had always been competitors in the world arena, and now the United States had vanquished its most recent competitor. And the United States, arguably, stood sort of higher compared to the rest of the world in 1991 than any country had ever stood compared to its competitors in that other country's era. Maybe. This was something that would actually take some time to play out. And reactions in the United States varied on what the United States ought to do about this. There were some who said, okay, now is the chance to accomplish what we had wanted to accomplish at the end of World War II through the United Nations, to establish this regime of collective security, where the peace-loving nations of the world will prevent the aggressive few nations of the world from beating up on their neighbors. And we're going to do this by punishing those who do, just as the United Nations and the American-led coalition in the United Nations had punished Iraq and forced Iraq out of Kuwait. And furthermore, that we're not going to have to do this again and again because other potential aggressors in the world are paying attention. And they will know that this fate will befall them should they act as Saddam Hussein had acted, and therefore they won't. So there were some who thought that this was a new era of peace and, peace and maybe democracy. So this was another aspect of what some Americans were thinking ought to follow the Cold War. The spread of democracy had often been stymied by the emergence, the growth of communism. Well, communism was this discredited philosophy. It had gone away in the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union ended, the Communist Party, the Soviet Union disbanded. The Chinese had largely given up on communism in all but name. It was still the Communist Party that ran China, but socialism, the economic form of communism, had been largely abandoned. And the Chinese had embraced something not exactly capitalism like that practiced in the United States, but capitalism with a large element of state support, sometimes called state capitalism. But it was based on markets, it was based on private ownership, and people could start businesses, and people, most importantly perhaps, people could get rich. And this had started shortly after the death of Mao Zedong in 1976. And the reforms took place over the years that had followed. And Chinese had indeed gotten rich. And the Chinese economy had grown, and Chinese were being lifted in large numbers out of poverty. But as I say, the leadership of China still called itself the Communist Party, and they still sort of talked in communist slogans, but nobody took seriously the communist part of the Chinese Communist Party. And most importantly, for our purposes here, communism didn't have any appeal to anybody else. It was just sort of a vestige that gave the leadership of China a reason to stay in power. But communism as this way of organizing governments and political economies had essentially no appeal in the early 1990s. So now is the chance for American-led capitalism to spread. Capitalism had spread and done very well in the European Union, the collection of European countries. And along with capitalism, the thinking of most Americans went democracy. And most Americans thought that democracy was this really good thing, that everybody should have democracy. And almost as many Americans thought that capitalism was really good. So American values and American institutions, it seemed, would be able to spread across the world. after the end of the Cold War, because the Soviet Union and communism generally had been a principal barrier to all of this sort of thing. So Americans were thinking pretty well of themselves and had great hopes. I should add that there are other Americans who said, wait a minute, no, we don't want to go save the world. We've been saving the world for the last half century, starting in 1941 at Pearl Harbor and ending, well, up right now we're about 1991. So that's neat, kind of half a century. And half a century is enough. We can save the world. We saved the world for half a century. Let's stop saving the world. Let's go back and deal with what we need to do in the United States. The American system, the American economy is always a work in progress. And we've been spending so much money on the military and on things relating to international affairs these last 50 years. Let's bring some of that stuff home. Let's get a post-Cold War peace dividends and devote this to affairs of the United States itself. Let the world deal with itself. No country ought to have to save the world forever, and we've done our part, so enough for us. So there was this split in American thinking. Complicating all of this was the fact that the world didn't seem to want to play along with either one of these versions of American thinking. The world turned out to be a complicated place, more complicated than most Americans had suspected. Now, one of the great advantages, one of the great conceptual advantages of the Cold War was that it simplified the world. Americans got used to thinking in terms of America, good, Soviet Union, bad, democracy, good, communism, bad, capitalism, good, socialism, bad. And you could extrapolate that into other countries. America's allies, good, Soviet allies, bad. Well, take away the Soviet Union, take away Soviet communism and so on, and this bipolar, this binary kind of organization, it falls apart. And furthermore, Americans often justified their own actions, American leaders and to some extent American voters, justified their country's actions in terms of being better than the actions of the Soviets and the communists. So yes, the United States did meddle in the politics of other countries. The United States toppled regimes that it didn't like in places like Iran and Guatemala, and tried to do so in Cuba and the Congo and places like that. But the United States was nowhere near as oppressive and brutal in doing that as the Soviet Union was, for example. And the Soviets basically marched into Eastern Europe at the end of World War II, and they never let up, and they never came out. And when Hungary in the 1950s and Czechoslovakia made noises and tried to get out of the Soviet alliance system, the Soviet army just crushed them. By contrast, the United States had not objected, at least not forcibly, when France decided to get out of the NATO system. And so Americans could justify their own actions. America's not perfect, Americans could say. But the Soviet Union is so bad that if we're better than them, we're on the side of the good guys. Life is, and especially international relations, is always the choice of the lesser of evils. You don't get to choose the perfect solution. So this was appealing during the Cold War. Part of the problem with the end of the Cold War for Americans is there was no longer this focus of evil that the United States merely had to be better than. Americans now, instead of just saying we're better than the Soviet Union, Americans had to kind of gauge their own actions of their country's actions on almost an absolute standard of good or bad. And so the United States, instead of measuring itself against this more imperfect country, in some thinking of Americans, had to measure itself against kind of absolute good. So anyway, Americans discovered that the world is more complicated. They also discover that not everybody is paying attention to the lesson that American leaders hoped the world had taken from the ejection of Iraq from Kuwait. George Bush's New World Order was supposed to teach the world this is what happens to aggressors. And future aggressors would say, oh, that's going to happen to me, therefore I won't commit aggression. No, it didn't work that way. And furthermore, even if it had, there were other problems that were simply more complicated than the problem of Iraq and Kuwait. And one of the principal problems that was really complicated was the breakup of Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia is a country that had been created in the wake of World War I, and it was out of the parts of the old Austrian Empire. And the parts had been put together and kind of mashed together and glued together a little bit, but it made this country that consisted of several very clearly self-identifying ethnic groups and religious groups who didn't have much in common one with the other, except that they lived nearby. They lived near each other. And the fact that they lived near each other didn't mean that they were much like each other or they much liked each other. It was much of that region is mountainous, and so one group being in one valley, another group in the other valley. They had been sort of held together by force during the Cold War, the force of, well, the leadership of a Yugoslav leader named Tito, that was the name he took, and by the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. Yugoslavia under Tito was this oddity. It was a communist but independent state. It was a communist state that wasn't allied to the Soviet Union. And that sort of served the purposes of the United States as forming a model of you can be communist, but you don't have to be allied with the Soviet Union. So the United States was able to get along okay with Yugoslavia. And the Soviets, well, they had their hands full and they didn't want to try to bring Yugoslavia under direct communist control. So it existed like this for a while. Tito died, and then the Cold War ended. And these forces, the sort of internal leadership force of Tito, who had great credibility within Yugoslavia for his actions in World War II against the Germans, and the external pressure of the United States and the Soviet Union, which sort of acted as these outer boundaries to keep Yugoslavia from flying apart. Well, those were gone. And Yugoslavia promptly flew apart. These different groups, they said, now it's time for us to have our nationalism. I've mentioned nationalism in previous lectures, the desire for a people that identify as a single people to have a country, a government of their own. This had started back in the 19th century, and it continued in the 20th century in the anti-colonial movement of the mid-20th century. And it extended now to the formerly communist sphere of Eastern and Central Europe, including Yugoslavia and the region called the Balkans, the Balkan Peninsula. And so there was this breakup of Yugoslavia. And the United States sort of took the position that, well, okay, the United States has supported nationalist movements, and if the Serbs want their own country, they should have their own country. And if the Bosnians want their own country, they should have their own country, and so on. But the problem was that the breakup of Yugoslavia did not happen peacefully. Anybody could have guessed that there would be difficulties because even though the groups had originally had their own territories over the years, especially over the years of the existence of Yugoslavia, they had moved around within Yugoslavia. And so you would find Serbs living in Bosnia and Bosnia living in what was going to be Serbia. And these ethnic groups often didn't get along too well. As long as Tito was there, Tito ruled with a firm hand, then things couldn't get out of line. And as long as the fear of intervention by the Soviet Union, or conceivably by the United States, existed, then these different groups would suppress their differences. But now there aren't these other forces, and so these differences come to the surface. And a series of civil wars break out in the former Yugoslavia in the Balkans. And Americans aren't quite sure what to do about this. Americans really are not, most Americans were not students of the politics of the Balkans, of this part of Europe. And so they had a hard time telling one group from another, and in a particular conflict, who was right and who was wrong. And a lot of Americans didn't want to get involved in this. This were now 20 years roughly after the sad, tragic ending for the United States of the war in Vietnam, and many Americans still hold the memories of that quagmire, as it was almost universally called. And the Balkans looked like it was going to be Vietnam times 2 or 3. So Americans really said, let's stay out of this. Furthermore, Americans had been willing enough to support the war against Saddam Hussein, sort of on behalf of the United Nations and on the principle of what George Bush the Elder called the New World Order. But that war turned out to have a messier ending than people realized. Saddam Hussein was still in power. Bush had hoped that Saddam's Iraqi enemies would topple him, but they didn't. He clamped even further down on Iraq. And the other thing is that the whole idea behind collective security in the war against Iraq was, we're not going to have to do this every year. Other countries will get the message, and so they'll not do what they might have done otherwise. But people in the Balkans seemed to pay no attention to what had happened in Iraq. So Americans were puzzled. A lot of them didn't want to get involved. This isn't our conflict. We don't know these people, and we're just going to get in the middle of things. nor did other European countries show a great deal of enthusiasm for this. One thing Americans said is, look, this is in Europe's backyard. This is a long way from the United States. Let the Europeans take the lead. But here, the Europeans, many of the countries, were a little bit constrained by their membership in NATO, and the United States has always been the leader of NATO. So the only organization, or the most obvious organization, that would engage in some kind of intervention in the Balkans would be NATO, but NATO was really led by the United States, and the United States wasn't enthusiastic about it. One other thing, and that is, after this moment actually, when the Soviet Union, in its last days, went along with the United States in the United Nations on the Iraq issue, the Soviet Union dissolves, and Russia is the heir. And Russia is the heir not only to what used to be much of the Soviet Union, but also to the Soviet seat on the UN Security Council, the permanent seat. So Russia has a veto now over actions by the Security Council. And Russia sort of gets in mind that with these Americans acting like they can rule the world, well, maybe we ought to put a little bit of damper on this. So that moment when the United States and the Soviet Union, the Americans and the Russians, were aligned in the UN was just a brief moment. And by the mid-1990s, the Russians were opposed to a lot of the stuff that the United States wanted to do. And if the United Nations had been able to get its act together, then maybe Americans would have been more willing to intervene in the Balkans. But the United Nations couldn't because of the Russian veto, and so the United States didn't. On a few occasions, NATO did intervene. There was an air campaign against groups that were particularly brutal among their neighbors, but nothing that accomplished a great deal for a long period of time, nothing permanent. Oh, and this was another aspect, another question, another problem. So if the United States intervenes in somebody else's conflict, how long do American troops have to stay there? One of the lessons taken away from Vietnam was Americans belatedly came to look at the fight in Vietnam as a fight among different Vietnamese groups. And the United States first started paying close attention in 1950. And American troops were still there in the early 1970s. So, that's one place. If American troops go into the Balkans, heaven help us, are they still going to be there a quarter century later? And nobody wanted to see that. So for all these reasons, the United States more or less sat on the sidelines and let what happened in the Balkans happen. It was a messy business. It was a brutal business at times. And no one quite knew what lesson to take away from this. Does this mean we ought to act sooner and more vigorously? Or should we really just stay away because there's no end to this? So there's that. There's another example of how individuals, neighbors, getting near each other can do great havoc on them. That erupted in Central Africa in the mid-1990s. And this was in the country of Rwanda, a relatively small country that most Americans knew next to nothing about. Most Americans hardly ever heard of Rwanda before. But in the mid-1990s, ethnic violence that had simmered over time, been around for a while between two different groups, the Hutus and the Tutsi, erupted into this full-blown genocide in which hundreds of thousands of Rwandans were killed. And the United States did next to nothing about it. For that matter, essentially no other country did anything substantial about it either. And the Rwandans were left to deal with this genocide themselves. At the time, at the moment, when Americans were being distracted by what was going on in the Balkans, and Americans were trying to figure out, okay, what is America's role in this post-Cold War world? Do we want to pull back? Do we want to stop trying to save the world? Or, well, while all this was going on, it was really hard to gin up any kind of enthusiasm for Americans to undertake an intervention in a part of the world that Americans had never intervened in before, as I say, in the heart of Africa. This had been pretty much off limits to American military intervention, even American diplomatic attention. And Americans, if they were confused by what was going on in the Balkans, they were just as confused by what was going on in Rwanda. Furthermore, the cost of the genocide, the number of people killed, didn't become apparent until after the fact. It's still not exactly clear exactly how many people were killed, but hundreds of thousands. And while it was going on, it was relatively easy to sort of turn a blind eye, to turn away, say this isn't our problem and maybe it will go away. After the fact, when the extent of the bloodshed became apparent, various American leaders said we should have done something, we really should have done something about it. But then it was too late. So anyway, all this pointed out that the world after the Cold War was this complicated place. And this idea that the United States, by virtue of having won the Cold War and being the most powerful country on earth, could do whatever it wanted, and that the world would become peaceful and happy and all this other stuff, that was seen as just an illusion, a daydream. And if anything, Americans began thinking of the Cold War as a time, looking back on the Cold War, as a time of relative simplicity. We sort of knew who the good guys were and who the bad guys were. And each day when we woke up, we knew where the trouble was going to be. You know, if it's true, well, there was the potential for a nuclear war, and that wasn't a good thing. But the world was more understandable then than it became in the post-Cold War world. So this is something, and Americans. This is a minor thing, but minor things can mean a lot. One of the things that over the years had given the Cold War its coherence was the very label, the Cold War. People knew what to call the period and what to call this competition, this state of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. They had a label for it, but nobody had a label for the post-Cold War period because there wasn't a single theme to it. And again, this is another way of saying the same thing, that if there's a single theme to policy, then policy is more understandable, and it's easier to get a grip and to generate some kind of momentum in one direction. But in the 1990s, people didn't know what to call it. Is this the post-Cold War period? Is this the period of American hegemony, to use a political science term? What is it? And nobody knew. And in fact, I'll say today, political scientists, historians, IR theorists, they still don't have a good and generally accepted label for the 1990s. It's the decade after the Cold War, but can you state it positively? What was it? Well, it was a decade of confusion, but that doesn't help much. There was another area in which confusion came to reign, and it had to do with the ability of individuals and groups who could not match the United States in firepower, who couldn't take the United States on in any kind of open confrontation, to defend what they saw their own interests against American power and influence by means other than regular war. There is a term in military theory, in international relations theory for this. It's called asymmetric warfare. Symmetric warfare is when the two sides look kind of alike. So when the German army attacked the Soviet army in 1941, that's symmetric warfare, where both sides look about alike and they use more or less similar tactics and strategy. Asymmetric warfare typically is the struggle that is fought by a weak country or even a weak group, less than a country, against a great power. For example, by terrorist groups or insurgent groups against a country like the United States. And it often took the form of terrorism. So terrorism is the committing of acts of violence, typically against civilian targets, for political effect. Often it takes the form of killing civilians to make a political point. And typically the goal is to change the policy of the government, that is the government over these civilians. But it's usually different from attacking an army. Then it might be called irregular warfare. But terrorism it doesn't try to sort of destroy enemy forces. It tries to demoralize the group, the government that is perceived as the enemy. And it is the resort of the comparatively weak. Terrorism has been around probably as long as there have been governments. It probably goes back thousands of years. You could call targeted assassinations, politically motivated assassinations, as a form of terrorism. In the period of the Cold War and post-World War II history in the United States, terrorism had sometimes taken the form of plane hijackings, and hijackings are often called skyjackings. They originated not really connected to terrorism much, but it was a way for individuals who were disillusioned with the United States to get out of the United States and go to some place like Cuba. So somebody on an airplane, a passenger, would pull out a gun. This is days when you actually get guns on planes. Pull out a gun, put it to the head of the pilot and say, "Fly me to Cuba," or "Fly me to Libya," or "Fly me to some place like that." And so Americans kind of got used to it, and they got used to it in the sense that these usually ended relatively peacefully. The planes didn't crash, not very many people got killed. Sometimes even the airlines would get the planes back from the country where the plane landed. And so Americans learned that if a plane gets hijacked, the best thing to do is sit down, shut up, and just keep your head down and hope everything turns out okay. This is going to be important. Keep this in mind. Starting in the 1970s and 1980s, another form of terrorism was the kidnapping and sometimes killing of American civilians in foreign countries. So there were a series of kidnappings of Americans in the context of a civil war that took place in Lebanon starting in the 1970s and continuing into the 1980s. And it was because there were Americans who were kidnapped in Lebanon at the behest of a group acting for the government of Iran that the Reagan administration got mixed up in what became called the IranContra scandal. So there were these killings, these kidnappings. In 1993, there was an attack on the World Trade Center in New York, in the Wall Street neighborhood of New York City. And this took things in a different direction. So all of a sudden, these foreign terrorists, and these were foreign-based terrorists, attacked a civilian target within the United States. The attack of 1993 was intended to bring down the World Trade Center, these twin towers that existed, and they were the most recognizable symbol of America's leadership of world capitalism. And so if you didn't like American capitalism, if you didn't like America's leadership of the World Trade Center was the target you would want to take on. Now this bombing, it was a truck bombing. The terrorist drove a bomb into the underground garage, detonated the bomb. It damaged the tower that the bomb was in. The idea was that this tower would topple, crash into the other one, bring that one down too, and they'd all fall down. It didn't happen that way. There were a lot of casualties, a number of deaths, and several hundred injuries. But the Trade Center towers stood. They were repaired, and life went back more or less as it was before. There was another terrorist attack. This one took place actually in the Middle East. And an American warship, the USS Cole, was approached by a group of terrorists in a small, swift boat. And they blew a hole in the side of the Cole. Again, a number of American servicemen and women were killed. In this case, the terrorists blew up with it as well. This was one aspect as well of the terrorism of the 1990s. Very often the individuals committed suicide in the operation. This made it very much harder to combat because if somebody is willing to die in the act, they're a lot harder to stop than if they have to get away. But the big attack came in September 2001. George W. Bush was president, the son of George H.W. Bush. And George W. Bush was expecting that his presidency would be relatively uneventful. He didn't have an idea that the United States would engage in foreign adventures. He especially didn't want to see the United States get more deeply involved in the Middle East. He was not in the nation-building business, as he said. And then on September 11th, 9/11/2001, the United States suffered the worst terrorist attack in American history, actually in the history of many countries, when 4 airliners, fully loaded with jet fuel, were crashed and targets in the United States. Well, 3 actually hit their targets. 2 hit the first, one of the towers of the World Trade Center, and another hit the other tower of the World Trade Center. These planes crashed into the towers, and they set the towers on fire. And the reason that the terrorists who had hijacked the planes, and remember that the old response to hijacking was just sit tight, everything will turn out okay. In this case, it didn't, because these hijackers were going to commit suicide and make these planes into guided missiles. And they crashed into the World Trade Center, and they set the World Trade Center, the towers, on fire. And after a relatively brief period of time, the tops of the World Trade Centers crashed down. The girders were weakened by the fire and collapsed the whole thing. And the 2 towers came crashing down, killing thousands of the people there, and a number of the first responders, the firemen and the policemen and the policewomen. A 3rd plane crashed into the U.S. Pentagon in Washington, D.C. So 2 of the planes hit the symbol of American capitalism. 3rd plane hit the symbol of the American defense establishment. A 4th plane presumably was going to target either the U.S. Capitol, where Congress meets, or the White House, where the president lives and works. But this plane didn't reach its target. It didn't reach its target because passengers on this plane had received phone calls from people on the ground who had heard about these other planes, and they realized that those planes were terrorist. This was a terrorist operation, and the same thing was presumably going to apply here. And the passengers apparently got into the cockpit and wrestled with the pilots and caused the plane to crash rather than reach its target. So on this day, Americans knew that they had entered a new age. This was an age that was quickly called the age of terrorism. America had been struggling for a label for the period after the Cold War. Now there is this new label, the age of terror.